Hello, my name is Ashley Lambert, and this is Very Sleepy, a podcast to help you fall asleep. So, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and settle in, and get ready for tonight's story from Tales from Norse Mythology, Asgard Stories, by Mary H. Foster and Mabel H. Cummings. Now, Mary H. Foster and Mabel H. Cummings are the authors of Asgard Stories, Tales from Norse Mythology. They wrote it as stories for children to feature the familiar Norse figures, including Odin, Thor, and Loki. The reason they created this is because they felt like the myths needed to be adapted for younger readers, because a lot of books on Norse myths, if you've ever dug into them, were very detail-heavy and hard for children to read. A lot of names and terms that are difficult to pronounce. Trust me, I had to look some up. They also believe that teaching of mythology should begin with the Norse myths, followed by the Greek myths for comparison. They did believe also the moral tone of the Norse myth and folktales were higher than those of the Greeks, and their main interest was to make the stories interesting, easy to read, and a catalyst for sparking imaginations. Not much is known about the authors outside of their contributions to Norse mythology, but a lot is known about the gods, the Vikings, and the mythology of the characters and history found within. The source texts mention numerous gods, probably many of which you've heard of: the hammer-wielding, humanity-protecting thunder god Thor, who relentlessly fights his foes; the one-eyed, raven-flanked god Odin, who craftily pursues knowledge throughout the worlds and bestowed among humanity the runic alphabet; or the beautiful, feathered, cloak-clad goddess Freya, who rides to battle to choose among the slain; and finally the vengeful god, the trickster, Loki. Just a little bit of history behind some of the stories. Most of the surviving mythology centers on the plights of the gods and their interactions with several other beings, such as humans, who may be friends, foes, family members of the gods. The cosmos in Norse mythology consists of 9 worlds that flank a central sacred tree, Yggdrasil. Units of time and elements of cosmology are personified as deities or beings, and various forms of a creation myth are recounted, where the world is created from the flesh of a primordial being, Ymir, and the first 2 humans are Ask and Embla. These worlds are foretold to be reborn after the events of Ragnarok, when an immense battle occurred between the gods and their enemies, and the world is enveloped in flames, only to be reborn anew. There, the surviving gods will meet, and the land will be fertile and green, and 2 humans will repopulate the world. With that being said, I hope that you enjoy the stories of Asgard, and I hope that it makes you very, very sleepy. The people who lived long ago in the far-off lands of the north watched the wonderful things that happened out of doors every day, just as we do. But they did not know about the one loving God, who is the Father of all, who made them and the world, and rules it by his wise laws. So they thought there must be a great many unseen powers living in the clouds, in the wind, in the storms, and the sunshine, and doing all those wonders that no man could do. And so those northern people, who were our own forefathers, came to believe in many gods, one for the sun, another for the thunder, another for the flowers, and so on. In the long, dark winters, when the bright sun had gone away from them, these Northmen had time to think many thoughts about the powers of frost and wind and storms, which they called giants. And they used to tell stories and sing songs about the short, bright summer, the thawing out of the streams and lakes, and the coming of the birds and flowers. With great joy, the people saw the bright sun god Baldur come back to them in the spring after the long darkness, and knew that they owed their lives to his friendly warmth and light. As we read the stories or myths told by these people long ago, we can see that they were meant to tell about the world around us. At first, the stories were told and sung from father to son, that is, from one generation to another. But later, when people learned how to write, these myths were written down and kept with great love and care. This is the story they told of the beginning. At first, before living creatures were in the world, it was all rough and without order. Far to the north, it was very cold, for ice and snow were everywhere. Toward the south, there was fire, and from the meeting of the fire and the cold, a thick vapor was formed, from which sprang a huge giant. On looking about for some food, he saw a cow who was also searching for something to eat. The ice tasted salt, and when the cow began to lick it, a head appeared, and at last the whole figure of a god stood before her. From these two, the giant and the god, came the two great races of giants and gods who were always enemies to each other. The giants were constantly trying to break into Asgard, the home of the gods in the sky. The gods, on the other hand, watched and planned to keep out the giants and to drive them back to their own stronghold, Utgard. Our world, where men and women lived, was between Utgard and Asgard. It was called Midgard. And around this Midgard wood, under the ocean, was coiled a monstrous serpent who grew so long that his tail grew down his throat. He was called the Midgard Serpent. A wonderful tree named Yggdrasil connected all the worlds. This great ash tree had its roots in Utgard, and the tops of his branches reached up so high as to overshadow Asgard. Its three main roots were watered by three fountains, and near one of them sat a wise giant, of whom we shall hear later. The Norns, three sisters, also lived at the roots of Yggdrasil and were careful to see that it was watered every day. A little gray squirrel was always running up and down the tree, jerking his tail and hurrying to tell the news to everyone along the way. He was so anxious to be the first one to carry the news that many times he brought trouble to himself and to others because he was not always careful to tell a story just as he had heard it. And often everyone would have been happier if the squirrel had kept the story quite to himself. The gods and goddesses all together were called the Aesir, and the chief and father of them all was Odin. His lofty throne rose high in the midst of Asgard, the sacred city, which the gods had built for their beautiful home. From Asgard, arching over and down to the lower world, was a rainbow bridge called the Trembling Bridge. Upon this, the dwellers in Asgard could travel every day, all except the mighty Thor. His thunder chariot was too heavy for the Trembling Bridge, so he had to go around a longer way. After the gods had made men and women and had taught them to dwell on the earth in the world of Midgard, Odin looked forth one morning from his heavenly seat to see what further work was waiting for his helping hand. He noticed, far away below him, a race of small beings, some of them busy doing mischievous deeds, while others sat idle, doing nothing. Odin sent for all these little people to come to him, and when they had reached Asgard and were admitted to his palace, they entered the great judgment hall, where they found all the Aesir sitting, with Father Odin at their head. The little people waited in a crowd near the door, wondering what was going to happen to them, while the messenger of the gods ran to his master to say that they had come. Then the All-Father spoke to the little dwarves about their evil deeds among men, and he told the naughtiest ones that they must go live down underground and look after the great furnace fire in the middle of the earth, to keep it always burning. Some must get coal to feed the fire, and others still were to have charge of the gold and silver and precious stones under the rocks. Not one of these busy dwarves must ever appear during the day. Only by night might they venture to leave their tasks. "And now," said Odin, turning to the idle ones, "what have you been doing?" "We were doing nothing at all, so we could not have harmed anyone, and we pray you to spare us," cried they. "Do you know that those who sit idle when they should be doing good deserve punishment too?" said Odin. "I shall put you in charge of all the trees and flowers, and shall send one of the Aesir to teach you, so that you may be doing some good in the world." Then the little elves went to work among the flowers, and Frey, the bright god of summer and sunshine, was a kind master to them. He taught them how to open the folded buds in the sunshine, to fill the honey cups, and lead the bees along the flower passages to find their food, to hatch the birds' eggs and teach the little ones their songs, and then each night to fetch the water for dewdrops to be hung on every leaf and blade of grass. When their work was finished and the moon had risen, these busy elves and fairies enjoyed many a happy evening, dancing and frisking on the green by moonlight. And so our world of Midgard was filled with busy work and play. Even now, in our time, the people in the lands of the north and in Germany have many old sayings and stories that have come down to them from the days long ago. There is a beautiful white flower in the north which is called Baldur's Brow, because it is so pure and bright, like the face of the dear sun god. And in some places, when the farmers gather in their harvest of grain, they leave a little bunch of it standing in the field for Father Odin's horse. We have some English names to remind us of those old tales of our forefathers, for we have Tuesday, named for Tyr, the brave god who gave his right hand to save his friends. Wednesday, or Woodensday, named for Odin. Thursday, for Thor, the thunder god. And Friday, for either the goddess Frigga or Freya, or for Frey, the god of summer who ruled the fairies. One morning, Thor asked Loki, the fire god, if he would like to go forth with him to Utgard, the stronghold of the giants, where he was going to try with his mighty hammer to conquer those fierce enemies of Asgard. Loki was glad to go with him, and the two gods started forth in Thor's chariot, drawn by two goats. Thor often went on a journey, so the dwellers in Asgard did not wonder to see him getting ready for a long drive. As Thor and Loki drove along, the heavy chariot rattled and made the thunder echo among the hills. People in our world down below in Midgard heard the rumbling and said, "What heavy thunderstorm! How the thunder crashes and rumbles." Toward evening, the travelers stopped at a peasant's hut, and Thor, alighting from his chariot, went to the door of the house to ask for shelter for the night. "I will gladly give you a room, but I have no food in the house," said the man who opened the door. "Oh, never mind that," said Thor. "I will provide the food." So Thor and Loki stopped for the night at the peasant's hut. They found the family within, the man, his wife, and two children, a boy and a girl. All looked on in great surprise to see Thor kill his two goats and cook them for the evening meal. "Eat all you wish," said Thor, "but be careful not to break any of the bones. Throw them all into the two skins which I have spread upon the floor." Now the boy wondered why Thor should say this, and as he happened to have a piece of the leg bone, he thought there could be no harm in breaking it open. Thor was just then talking to Loki and did not notice what had been done. But the next morning, the boy learned a lesson that he would never forget. When Thor was ready to start off again next day, he held his magic hammer over the skins in which lay the bones. All at once, the goats became whole again and stood there just the same as before, except that one of them now limped with his hind leg. Then the young Thielf knew why Thor had told him not to break the bones. At first, when he saw Thor's angry face and how he grasped his hammer, the boy was frightened and wanted to run away. But soon he remembered it would be cowardly to do that. So he went to Thor and asked his forgiveness. Now, the mighty thunder god, though often angry, was always just and kind. After scolding the boy as he deserved, he freely forgave him and said that he and his sister might go along with Loki and himself on their journey. The four started off, after saying goodbye to the peasant and his wife, leaving in their charge the chariot and goats, for it seemed best to finish the journey on foot. At nightfall, they entered a thick forest, through which they wandered on for miles, when all at once they came upon a house, and a strange-looking house it was. The wide front door opened into a big room. At the left was a small room, and just opposite the front door were 4 long, narrow rooms. The travelers wondered to find a house in the depths of a forest, but they were glad to have shelter for the night, and all lay down for a good rest. Soon after midnight, they were awakened by groans and strange sounds, and the earth began to tremble. Thor sent his companions into the farthest room, grasped his hammer, and stood on guard by the door. At daybreak, he started forth to find out what had caused the noise. He had not gone far when he came upon a huge giant, lying on the ground asleep. And Thor found that he was making the earth tremble with his snoring, which must have been the sound they had heard in the night. While Thor was looking at the giant, he awoke and spoke to the god. "Ho ho, I think you, little fellow, must be Thor, of whom I have often heard, but really I did not think you were quite so small. Now that the sun is up and I must be off, but where is my other glove? Oh, here it is on the ground." And the giant stooped and picked up his glove, which was the very house in which our 4 travelers had spent the night, with the big front room where the hand went in, the thumb for the one side room, and the 4 narrow finger rooms opposite the door. "If you're going my way, you may come along with me," said the giant. So they journeyed together for one day, but even mighty Thor could hardly keep up with the giant's long strides. When night came, the giant stopped under a large oak tree and said, "I am going to sleep. You may eat your supper if you wish. Here is a bag full of things." Saying this, he fell asleep and was soon snoring. But when Thor tried to open the bag of food, he could not untie the cord. This made him angry, for the giant had tied up their food with his own. He looked at the huge figure lying before him asleep, and when he thought what a mean trick the giant had played upon them, Thor seized the magic hammer and threw it at him. "Did a leaf fall on me?" said the giant sleepily. "Haven't you eaten your supper yet? Well, I'm going to sleep again." And soon he was snoring louder than before. Thor grasped his hammer tighter than ever and threw it with such strength that it seemed as though it must surely have killed the giant. But again he rubbed his eyes and said, "I thought an acorn fell on my head." He had hardly spoken when he was asleep again. Then, a 3rd time, Thor hurled his hammer with all his strength, and it seemed to hit his enemy in the forehead, and was buried out of sight. But the giant only said, "I think there must be birds overhead in this tree. I thought a feather dropped down on me. Are you awake, Thor? I think we'd better be going on with our journey, and if you are bound to go to Utgard, I will show you the way, but I advise you to go home instead. You will find bigger fellows than I in Utgard." But Thor made up his mind to go on, and nothing could make him change. At noontime, the four friends left their giant guide, whose path led another way. They had not traveled far when Thor spied a large city looming up before them, and soon they came to Utgard, the home of the fierce giants. Although it was surrounded by high walls, Thor and his friends were able to creep through the bars of the great gate. When they came to the palace and found its door open, they went in, and there sat all the giants, with their king, Utgard Loki, at their head. A quite different Loki was this giant king from the mischievous fire god, the Loki from Asgard, who now stood before him. Upon seeing the four strangers, the king of the giants said, "Why, this must be the god Thor. I really did not suppose that you were such a little fellow, Thor, but perhaps you are stronger than you look. Now, before you sit down at our table, you must each show some proof of your strength." And Loki, who was very hungry, said he was sure he could eat more than anyone else. So the king called one of the giants to come forth, saying to Loki, "If you can indeed eat more than one of my men, you will perform a great feat." A huge trough full of meat was brought in, and Loki began eating at one end, while the giant began at the other. They reached the center together, but Loki had eaten only the meat, while the giant had devoured the meat, the bones, the trough, and all. The peasant boy took his turn next and boasted that he was the fastest runner of them all. "Oh," said the king, "it will be a most wonderful feat if you can win a race against one of my men." The first time Thialf ran the course, he kept ahead until near the end and was beaten by only a few yards. The second time, he came off worse, and the third time, he was only halfway around when the giant had reached the goal. Thor, however, was not at all cast down by the failure of the others, and he proposed to try a drinking match. So the king brought forth a long drinking horn, saying, "My men usually empty this in one draught if they're very thirsty, though sometimes they have to take it in 2 swallows, or even 3. Then Thor put his lips to the drinking horn, and in one long deep pull, thinking he had surely emptied it, but to his surprise, the water had lowered only a few inches. Again he lifted the horn, feeling sure he should empty it this time, yet he did no better than before. The king said, "You have left a great deal for your last drink." This made Thor try his very best, but it was of no use. He could not empty the horn. "So, you're not as strong as you seemed after all. Do you care to try anything else?" said the king of the giants in a mocking tone. "Oh, certainly, anything you like," replied Thor. "Well," said the king, "I will give you something easy this time, since I see you are not as strong as I expected. You may try to lift this cat from the floor. It would be mere child's play for one of my men." Thor put out his hand to lift the cat, but he could raise only one paw, though he used all his strength. "Well, it is no more than I expected," said the king. "You boast of your strength, but you do not show it to us." By this time, Thor was getting very angry, and he spoke fiercely. "I will challenge any one of you to fight with me." The king looked about the hall to find someone small enough to wrestle with Thor. Then he said, "All of my men are too large. I shall have to send for one of the women." Soon a bent old woman came hobbling in, and Thor thought it would be nothing to overcome her, but the longer they wrestled, the stronger the old woman became. And at last, when it was plain that she was going to win, and Thor had been thrown down upon the floor, the king called for them to stop. Thor and his friends were then invited to sit down at the feast, and the next morning, after a good breakfast, they started on their journey homeward. Utgard Loki, the giant king, went with them to the city gate, and when he was about to leave them, said, "Do you find it as easy as you expected to overthrow the giants?" No, said Thor, who was too honest to hide his shame. I am vexed that I have done so little, and I know that after this failure you will all laugh at my weakness. No, indeed, replied the king. Since you are now well outside our stronghold, I will tell you the truth about what you saw there, and I will take good care not to let you get in again. You have greatly surprised us all, for we did not dream that you were so strong, and I have had to use magic to hold out against you. When you first met the first giant in the forest, you would have killed him with your hammer if he had not put a mountain between himself and you. Loki was a wonderful eater, but we matched him against fire, and who can devour more than fire? The boy was a swift runner, and I had to make him race against thought in order to beat him. What can be swifter than thought? The horn from which you drank was the ocean, and you took such a mighty draught that the people in Midgard saw the tide ebb. It was really not a cat that you tried to lift, but the Midgard serpent, and you pulled him so far that we feared he would let go his hold. Then you wrestled with old age, and who is there that can overcome old age? With these words, the giant king vanished, and Thor, upon looking around, saw the city of Utgard was also gone. Then silently, but with many thoughts of these strange things, Thor and Loki with the boy and the girl made their way back to Asgard. The end. I hope you enjoyed one of the many stories of Asgard. I hope it made you very, very sleepy. Thank you so much for all the downloads and the reviews, as always. You are all amazing. I hope you're all safe and well around the world. If you're new here, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Keep an ear out for next week's story from the book Wonder Tales from Many Lands by Catherine Pyle, The Magic Rice Kettle, a story from South Korea. I hope you have a wonderful week. I'm Ashley Lambert, and this is Very Sleepy. Until next time, good night.